Morning, everyone. I'm Rob Atkinson, president of the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation. And I'm really excited this morning because we have a great panel on a great topic. I would argue this is the topic being what's going to happen with the two big competitiveness bills now that have passed each chamber, the House and the Senate. USICA in the Senate, America Competes in the House. We're going to have a really, I think, interesting discussion. What's going to happen, what they should do when they go to conference, and ultimately send a bill to the president. But given that I'm a industrial strategy wonk, I think this is the most important bill of the year by far, probably the most important bill of the last decade. We've got to get this right. So we have a great panel. I'm going to introduce everybody first. We're going to then go over to a recorded video with Senator Todd Young, and then we'll go and have conversations with folks here. Let me start with introducing Senator Young. He is the Republican senator from the state of Indiana. He's on the Senate Senate Finance, Foreign Relations, Commerce, Science and Transportation, and Small Business and Entrepreneurship. And prior to joining the Senate, Senator Young was also a House member. What's important about Senator Young is that he was the co-sponsor, was the co-sponsor of the Endless Frontier Act, which was really the beginning of all of this that Senator Schumer led. And so Senator Young's co-sponsorship was quite vital to that, signaling that this is a bipartisan issue. And I think it's a core reason why USICA got, 70 votes, so a lot of Republican votes. Okay. Folks on our live stream today will be Dave Vasco. Dave is the Director of Advanced Technology at Rockwell Automation. Rockwell is a great company headquartered in Milwaukee. They're basically an industrial automation systems company. He's responsible for applied R&D and global product standards and regulations. He is also a member of the visiting committee on advanced technology at NIST. So he has a deep understanding of NIST, and he's also on the board of the Smart Manufacturing Leadership Coalition. And unlike the rest of us, Dave holds 50 patents. So he is actually a real engineer and inventor. Bruce Andrews is Corporate Vice President and Chief of Government Affairs at Intel, where he leads the company's global government affairs group. Previously, Bruce was at SoftBank. He had also been at Rock Creek Advisors, and then in the Obama administration, he was Deputy Secretary of Commerce, where he also, before that, he was General Secretary. You were not General Secretary, you were General Counsel to the Senate Commerce Committee. Stephen Ezell is the Vice President of ITIF and leads our global innovation policy work. Stephen's done yeoman's work on a wide variety of areas, but in particular, U.S. manufacturing and manufacturing policy and technology, and also semiconductors and global competition there. David Hart is the director of ITIF's Clean Energy Innovation Program, and follows the clean energy issues and R&D quite closely, and also is a professor at George Mason University School of Public Policy. And I think you're still department head, unfortunately, right? You're on mute, David, but I'll take that as an affirmative.
Not really, no.
Not really? Good, you got out of that. All right. Okay, so Riley, if we could start with Senator Young wanted to join us, but unfortunately today he couldn't for committee assignments, but he did, he was kind enough to record an interview with me the other day. So let's see if we can hear that. Good morning, everyone. We're so pleased to have a conversation with Senator Todd Young, who we've pre-recorded this before our event we're doing now. Senator Young represents the state of Indiana. He is on the Senate committees on finance, foreign relations, commerce, science and transportation, as well as small business and entrepreneurship. Previously, he was in the House, where he served on the Armed Services Committee and the Budget Committee, and most recently Ways and Means. I was very honored and pleased to work with Senator Young's team on the USICA, what was originally the Endless Frontier bill that he co-led with Senate Leader Schumer. And then that, as everybody knows, got transformed or merged in with a broader set of initiatives to be called USICA, the U.S. Innovation and Competition Act. So, Senator, thank you, and a pleasure that you've joined us.
Rob, thanks for having me so much.
Great. So I wanted to ask you a question. Why did you agree to be the lead on Endless Frontier? You could have just said, "Oh, I like it, I'll sign on." Well, you took the lead, and you've done a lot of pushing to get it moving, and we got a number of Republicans to be on the bill. What motivated you to do that?
Well, it was a number of things. I guess at one point, it took me to the Senate gym. But let me step back a second and paint the picture as to what was going on in my mind as I decided to team up with Senator Schumer on this. As I entered the Senate, I really thought that it was important for me in light of how our economy has changed structurally in recent decades between globalization and what some have called the Fourth Industrial Revolution and the depopulation of many of our communities. Our society's undergone a lot of ferment, if you will, and I think an absence of fresh thinking on the economic side of things has created frustration among rank and file Americans that they feel underutilized, and oftentimes their communities have suffered. So I strove to understand this better. And in visiting with people like yourself to get a better appreciation for some of these changes and studying quite a bit, I came to really think that we needed to be more attentive to this issue of competitiveness. And throughout our own economic history, we've seen innovation as being a key to that competitiveness. So that was sort of one strand of thought. Another one was just a general realization that when we think about our competitiveness challenges with China, we didn't really have an overall strategy to pursue these. And we still lack a sufficiently teased out strategy, from tariffs to export controls to sanction policy, financial markets, and national security innovation base. How are we going to sustain it? No coherent strategy. So I teased out, the need for a national economic security strategy, introduced some legislation to that end. It was about at that point that I had a conversation with Senator Schumer in the Senate gym. We had come to know one another casually. We came to understand that each of us shares an animus towards the Chinese Communist Party and a desire to develop a more coherent economic approach as it relates to our generational competition with China. And so that became the Endless Frontier Act. And here we are.
Well, that's great. I remember one time I was in your office and you had invited me in to talk about some of these questions and these issues. And I always remember there must have been there were a whole slew of articles and books on your table that you were working your way through to really get a much deeper understanding of this issue, which is great. But I want to get a little bit into politics. You're a Republican, but you also understand that there are certain things the government has to do. There are certain things the government shouldn't do, but there are also things government needs to do. There's been some pushback from, if you will, free market folks, some free market folks who have said, and Phil Graham had an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal that I read, I was quite troubled with. He said that this bill is copying China and it's inconsistent with our economic policy heritage. When I read those, I wonder, did they actually read the bill? Because the bill is you have a Republican governor in Indiana, and that person is doing pretty much what's in the bill. They're trying to recruit companies. They're building up their university base. They're building up their workforce. They're helping certain cities. Really, what this bill is about is just building on what Democratic and Republican governors have done. And then they don't seem to have ever read Alexander Hamilton's report on manufacturers. They somehow think that Adam Smith was an American. We've had a long tradition of where the government helps. The government plays a role. Lincoln, obviously, one of the most prominent Republican. Land grant colleges, helping farmers become more productive, opening up new lands, transcontinental railroads. So we have a rich tradition here. I'd just be curious, Senator, what would you say to some of those folks to help them understand that we're living in a new world and we need new actions?
Well, let me say, as someone like you, Rob, who's studied some economics, in my case, I studied economics at the University of Chicago. I've studied economic models. I've studied narratives about economies. And I generally agree with narratives that give primacy to markets. I think most people who are watching this would agree with that. And that doesn't divide Republicans and Democrats if you take it that far. I think we, in recent history, have weighted the importance of government in different ways, and still do to this day. But too many of our economic narratives in my own party and in the other party have become simplistic. It's as though there's an economic conversation occurring on a political talk show. And even some of our what are regarded as best minds when it comes to policy making to advance economic growth sound more to me like political analysts or politicians than they do someone who's familiarized themselves with and informing their policy making by actual events, economic history. You know, we saw in the 20th century our federal government continue to play a very vital and vigorous role in defending our innovators, our investors, our entrepreneurs, and that should continue to be the case. So this was, again, one of the things that led me to revisit some of what I think were my preconceived notions about economic growth. Many of us came that are watching this and are Republicans, sort of came to our politics by referencing Thatcher and Reagan and some of the terrific things I think they did to help advance economic growth and keep us competitive. And their leadership, I think, was a necessary corrective to a sclerotic and a challenging time for their respective countries. But times have indeed changed. Our economy has changed, and our public policies, after a 4-decade interval, should be revisited. And so that's what I would say to some of my friends is we're trying to replicate not what the Chinese Communist Party has done in order to grow more here. We're trying to replicate the successes of an earlier era when we understood that there were certain key things, whether it's research or infrastructure or workforce development, that government needs to invest and invest robustly in. And that's why this legislation, which will beef up the capacity of the National Science Foundation, our national labs, DARPA, will be really important to supporting our private sector as we try and win the 21st century as Americans.
Yeah, Senator, it reminds me of your point about new facts, new realities come to bear, and people adjust their thinking. There's a famous John Maynard Keynes quote where a woman comes up to him and says, Lord Keynes, why have you changed your position? I thought, and Keynes said, well, madam, when the facts change, I change my views. What do you do? And the facts certainly have changed. The other point you made, Senator, I thought was a good one. There seems to be almost a hagiography of President Reagan. It forgets what President Reagan really did. He had his own Competitiveness Council, chaired by John Young from HB. He was the one who helped support and advance the research and development tax credit. His director of National Science Foundation created a whole new set of programs at NSF oriented to industry. So President Reagan was really focused on competitiveness back then, and people just seemed to only think about tax cuts or the important things he did around deregulation, but they somehow have lost the other parts where the president said we do need to work in public-private partnerships. At that time, it was beating the Germans and the Japanese. Now it's a different challenge.
So one of the challenges, I would say, opportunities that exist with this legislation is to flip the script a bit, to revisit economic history, to revisit the policy that occurred in the 80s and some of the things that led to our success in defeating the Soviet Union and ensuring prosperity for my generation. And I'm excited about that. It comes with certain work hazards, though. I mean, it can be very challenging to change this narrative when you're afforded 60 seconds on a talk radio hit or the television, which is why I appreciate this opportunity. Rob, I think you're muted.
Sorry, thank you. There was some background noise. Thank you.
Yeah.
I want to wrap up, but I want to get into one specific issue, and that's when the USICA bill, I thought, had some very, very important provisions with regard to the National Science Foundation, in particular creating this new directorate for more, a little bit later stage research focused on initially these 10 core areas that we know are going to be important to the America's future. Things like artificial intelligence or quantum computing, and then also to make sure that there was some industry engagement there. Could we get industry more engaged at research universities? The House bill in the America Competes Act is, in my opinion, weaker. It doesn't go that far, and I think it's partly because the traditional science community likes the status quo. Your thoughts on that, or how that came about, and why you think the Senate bill's better, as I do, and perhaps where that all might go when it comes to conference?
Well, thank you for your thoughts on that. I agree, Rob, and I'm glad you support the Senate version. I'm encouraged to know so does the White House, and so do a number of my Democratic colleagues, even though they cast a vote in support of the Competes Act. The bottom line is, if we want this to pass, it's going to have to resemble the Senate bill. This is what so many Republicans are supportive of on this side of the U.S. Capitol, and I think most of the stakeholders understand that. But as a substantive matter, the weight of investment is heavier towards applied research in some of the discrete areas where we know we need to make considerable advancements as a country in coming years. Artificial intelligence, quantum computing, to name a couple of notable examples. The Senate, after some negotiation and going through a regular order, bipartisan, transparent process, ended up not with the original proposal of $100 million over 5 years for the tech directorate, but instead roughly $30 billion for the tech directorate, and then $50 billion for the other more traditional curiosity-driven functions of the National Science Foundation. Listen, what took us to this place was some principled compromises, some accommodation of our colleagues. I understand that's part of the political process, and I think we still ended up in a strong spot. In contrast, the House, I don't think most people are making the argument that the weight of investment there is sufficient, especially sufficient to compete against China. We're looking at a $13 billion, if I recall correctly, invested in emerging technologies over on the House side, and a lot of money going in other places. If we compare this with China, they've already surpassed the United States in funding. Now, blessedly, the quality of so many of our researchers and our private investment keeps us, by most accounts, ahead in some of these important areas. But those trend lines will change in fairly short order if we don't get on the stick. And I should mention, the Senate bill includes a provision to crowd in talent and treasure from our allied partners as well. So to the extent we can collaborate on some of this research and bring in others as a force multiplier, that will be terrific. Because as we think about the competitiveness challenges of the 21st century, it's not just America versus the Chinese Communist Party. It's really the Western world and our collective values that are competing against the Chinese Communist Party. So one can imagine a situation in which we would develop common standards for some of these technologies so we can trade with one another and ensure those technologies are embedded with our values as opposed to those of an autocratic state.
Yeah, and I obviously, President Putin's aggression, if there's an upside of any kind, it is that it, I think, will bring the allies together, including going down this path of what you're just talking about, closer and tighter cooperation around these technologies so the West remains strong.
Indeed.
I did want to ask you one last question about process, though, and I know that sometimes it's hard to answer that because everything's in the middle and it's confidential, but anything you can just say to the audience about this is going to go to conference, sense of when that might be, how long we're looking at, what the process might be?
Yeah, what I can say is first, I want to emphasize one of the reasons the Senate product is better is because we had a very open process, so-called regular order, where you actually hold committee hearings in the light of day and accommodate your colleagues. And that's why we ended up with just about 70 votes coming out of the U.S. Senate. In contrast, the House bill was put together in Speaker Pelosi's office, to my knowledge, and received Democratic votes. I think there was one exception on the Republican side. So we're going to improve upon that moving forward. I anticipate equal Republican and Democrat representation when we finally have conferees named and we go to conference. And I believe that will happen in coming weeks here. So it's been a long time since we've been through the how a bill becomes a law process. I'm thinking we can measure, the time required to hash out the many thorny details from issues like trade that excite some emotions. It'll take a couple few months, I would imagine, and then at some point in the summer, we should get this done. If we fail to get this done, there's a very serious signaling challenge that we have to keep in mind. Not only will it send a bad message domestically to many of our investors, to our people, but the signal it would send to our adversaries and even our friends, I think is something we want to avoid. So we're starting to get our act together with respect to our national security innovation base. If we can get this done, I think there's no stopping us as we head deeper into the 21st century.
Yeah, I 100% agree. This to me is you're not supposed to use too many terms of saying this is unique, but I think this is a watershed moment here for our country. And if we can go down the path of getting a good bill that looks a lot like USICA, that's fully funded. And we didn't talk about all the other things, the technology hubs for the heartland, the CHIPS Act, the China trade provisions in that bill. There's so much in this bill that's, just to me has to get done. So I'm really appreciate your leadership on that. Senator, before we close, any last thoughts you had, any last comments?
Well, I'm grateful for this opportunity, and you should know, Rob, and all who are watching should know, your assistance, Rob, was incredibly important to me. When you mentioned I was reading through articles and in the early days of my Senate term, I was really wrestling with a lot of fundamental issues. You helped me through that process. ITIF helped me through that process. And this is the way to make legislation, is to draw in the best minds and collectively work to get things passed. So we still got some work to do, but I think it's important everyone knows how important your leadership has been. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Senator. I'm really honored to hear that. And it was a pleasure to work with you and your team. So with that, thank you so much for joining us. And everybody here will have fingers crossed. Okay. Well, that was a great interview, I thought, with Senator Young, and really his leadership on this has been fantastic. So, as I said, fingers crossed. So now we want to jump into some of the more specifics of the actual bill and all. And I want to start with Bruce Andrews from Intel, and obviously talking about the CHIPS Act and the issues, the initiatives in there to help bolster semiconductor production here in the U.S. So, Bruce, over to you.
Sure. Well, thanks, Robin. First of all, to echo Senator Young, thank you for your leadership, and actually thank you to Senator Young, Senator Schumer, and all of the sponsors, Congresswoman Matsui, Congressman McCall. This has been so important, their leadership, because you hit the nail on the head to start with, which is this really is one of the most important issues of our time. Where the oil wells were located has been the most important issue of the last 50 years. Where the semiconductor fabs are located is going to be the most important issue for the next 30 to 50 years. And, I was lucky. I started actually working on these issues in the Obama administration, started the Obama Semiconductor Initiative. But I think even then we didn't realize how unbelievably important this issue was going to be, and what the U.S. needs to do to make sure that we're competitive. Because the whole situation with COVID and the Ukraine and the shortage of various supplies and key technologies has really has reminded us why geographic concentration and over-reliance on specific areas can be such a problem, and why the resiliency and strength of a broad manufacturing base is so important. And as we look at what the future looks like, we live in an increasingly digitized world. I mean, the fact that automakers are not able to sell cars because a 20-cent microchip that runs the seat heaters or runs other parts of the car are slowed down just reflects that every part of our lives going forward is going to be digitized. So we see a huge increase, looking out at what the semiconductor demand is going to look like. And this is really not only an economic security issue, it's also a national security issue, because having a broad and resilient supply chain, not having an overly concentrated industry, is important to the United States. It's important to Europe, and to every country. Because one thing that's important is looking back at the statistics. In 1990, the U.S. was more than 30% of the global semiconductor capacity or production. Europe was more than 20%. Now that's changed so that it's only 12% in the U.S., 9% in Europe, and about 80% of production is in Asia. And, there's a reason for this, which is it's not like, Congress got together and took a vote and said, hey, let's move all of the fabs to Asia. Let's move them to, whether it's Taiwan or, China or wherever. It was really because of the governments in those countries made a very affirmative decision to bring the semiconductor manufacturing and the supply chains to their countries. They offered huge incentives. They heavily subsidized the move. And TSMC is a great example. TSMC is a fabulous and impressive company, but one of the reasons that they're so successful is this huge support that they've received for the Taiwanese government. And so, because the governments that were proactive in what would be called industrial policy have been remarkably successful in building the industries in their countries, which is good, but it's led to a huge concentration, particularly in Taiwan and China, that we need to make sure that there's more diversity too. Because right now there are 3 leading edge fab companies in the world: Samsung, TSMC, and Intel. And SMIC in China is also trying to get into that category, but they're not really at the leading edge. But the Chinese government is spending a huge amount of money trying to get them to be more successful on the leading edge. And what's interesting is Intel is in the process of really transforming our business model, going from being just a company where we design and manufacture our own chips to actually building chips for others as well. And so we've actually made a number of announcements. One is the $20 billion investment that we're going to make in Ohio, what we've dubbed the Silicon Heartland. We're making a $20 billion investment in Arizona to build fabs. We're making a $4.5 billion investment in New Mexico to build packaging plants. And then yesterday, we actually announced about $33 billion in new investment in Europe, particularly in what is going to be 2 leading edge fabs in Germany. So we see the production going up around the world and the need. And so we're acting to meet that demand. And so the question is, why do we need the CHIPS Act? And it's actually a pretty simple question, which is, do we want to have a resilient supply chain in the U.S., in a supply of chips in the U.S. and Europe, or do we want to be dependent on other countries, and particularly a very geographic concentrated area in Asia? And why this is important, why chips is important, is the cost differential between manufacturing, say, in the U.S. versus Asia versus Taiwan or Korea is about 30%, 30 to 40%. And that's because of the subsidies and the incentives that those government gives their companies. In China, it's about a 50 to 60% cost differential. India has offered big new incentive packages. Japan has offered big incentive packages. And the Europeans have their own EU Chips Act, which is one of the things we'll benefit from as we build our fab in Germany. If the U.S. wants to be competitive in the semiconductor manufacturing sector, it's very simple. We as a company, we're a good example, but all of our fellow companies that manufacture in the United States can't be successful and can't be globally competitive if the U.S. doesn't help to close the cost differential. Because the reality is, without the CHIPS Act, we're going to have to go somewhere to manufacture where there's not such a big cost differential. Otherwise, we can't be globally competitive. And so that's actually, it's pretty simple. For companies to be able to manufacture competitively in the United States, we need the CHIPS Act. And the last point I would make is the urgency. As I said, the rest of the world is moving fast. The United States has to catch up. The Senate passed USICA last June. It's been kind of wandering around since then. The House acted. They're kind of moving at the speed of Congress for the conference. And when we look at it, the rest of the world's moving. We need to see Congress move faster as well. So let me stop there.
Bruce, that was great. Thank you. You mentioned a couple of statistics there. I just encourage folks more interested in more on that. My colleague Stephen Ezell, who will be joining us in just a few moments, has written a number of reports laying all that out. Bruce, I want to ask you a related question. It's interesting because we had the CHIPS Act last year, and it's only been in the last maybe couple of months, I think, that sort of the opponents or critics have come out of the woodwork. And I often wonder if they've read the bill. But one of them, one critique you have is, we have this shortage now, which is true, and that we don't need the CHIPS Act to deal with the shortage. What's wrong with that? With that as the basis of the argument against chips?
Well, look, so here's the point, Rob, which is, it takes about 3 years to build a fab. And everybody on this webcast knows very well that every item that we all use is getting more and more digitized, whether it's the thermostats in our house, whether it's, a premium automobile used to be about 4% semiconductors. That's projected to grow to 20% semiconductors. So demand is going to go up significantly. And if we continue to rely on an overly geographically concentrated area, particularly Taiwan and China, the risks in a very geopolitically challenging, intense world to not have that diversity. In the same way we learned not having diversity of supply chain cost us with PPE at the beginning of the COVID crisis. So we see demand just continuing to grow and grow and grow. And with that demand, if both the capacity for manufacturing, but also the geographic diversity of both manufacturing and supply chains doesn't grow, then we're just going to be back in this same problem. And, one of the things we saw with PPE, which is a real big problem, was that countries tended to say, okay, we want to keep our supply in our country. So think about that in chips. If we have a chip shortage in the future and the countries, so Korea, Taiwan, China say, oh no, we're going to keep all our chips in our country. We're not going to export them to the United States. We're not going to export them to Europe. That's one of the reasons we see building leading edge fabs, both more in the United States and in Europe, is very important.
Yeah, and related to that, the chips industry really since its inception has been quite cyclical in terms of capital investment. You go through these booms and busts, if you will, and now we're in this point where there's going to be a lot of global CapEx. And the real question is not that there won't be global CapEx, it's a question of how much of it will be in the U.S.
That's right.
And we want as much as possible.
And that's a really important question, because what this really comes down to is, do we want the capacity to be built in the U.S. or somewhere else? Because the reality is, without the CHIPS Act and without the partnership with the U.S. government, it's just going to be built somewhere else. Everyone else, I mentioned India, Korea, South Korea, Japan. Everyone else in the world is working hard to build their chips industries. And without us doing that, we're just going to be left behind. And we're going to be at the will of others to be asking, for chips if there's a shortage in the future.
So I want to ask you a couple more questions. And this is related to what changes we want to make sure don't happen when it goes to conference. And one of the proposals or critiques that you've heard from a few folks on the Hill, not very many, is, well, we can use this CHIPS Act as a lever to decouple from China, and the idea would be don't give any CHIPS Act support to any company that has anything to do with producing in China. Tell us why that is not a very good idea.
Sure. And that's a really good question, Rob, because one of the things I will tell you, all the other countries that are doing this, none of them are attaching strings. They're not telling us how we should run our company. They're not asking to give equity. They're not saying you can't build here and there. Intel is a perfect example. As I just laid out, we've announced over $80 billion in capital expenditures in the United States and Europe. But the challenge is in order to be a globally competitive company, we need to be successful in the Chinese market. And what the U.S. government should be doing is saying, not how do we decouple, it's how do we make sure that our companies are able to be successful in China? Because the reality is about 60% of semiconductors touch China, between Chinese consumption and the manufacturing that takes place in China. So for people to say, oh, we don't want you to be in China, that's a short way of saying we don't want you to be successful in a global marketplace. And the reality is, let's say you tie us, American companies' hands through CHIPS money. The problem with that is it doesn't tie our global competitors. So all of our global competitors are going to go and take market share from us in China. They're going to be successful. And so instead of helping U.S. companies to be more globally competitive, you're actually just sending the revenue that we would generate from, whether it's from China, where you're sending it to Taiwan, you're sending it to South Korea, or frankly, you're just keeping it in China. And that doesn't serve anybody's interest well, to make U.S. companies less globally competitive when the whole point is trying to make the U.S. industry more globally competitive.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Bruce, one last question. Some have proposed, I think maybe as a way to maybe stretch out this money, that rather than give grants, which, by the way, we should note that CHIPS is really several things. One of them is about incentives for putting fabs here. The other is about advanced R&D. Both are important. But on the grant part, some people have said, why don't we just do loans instead, or loan guarantees? Why is that not a good idea?
Well, so the problem with that is the cost differential that I talked about earlier. The CHIPS Act, this is not some kind of corporate welfare. This is intended to make the U.S. competitive against other companies or countries, and to close the gap in cost between the U.S. and other jurisdictions. So that 30 to 40% that I talked about, without us being able to close that 30, 40% gap, it just means we have to go manufacture somewhere else. And Intel, my CEO has been very clear. We think that having diversified and resilient manufacturing and supply chains is important. But if you say to us, we're not going to help close, if the U.S. government says, hey, you're putting $43.5 billion of capital expenditure in the United States, but we're not going to help you to close that cost gap, it's going to force us to go somewhere else where they will. And as I mentioned earlier, every other country, the number of calls I get on a daily basis from countries saying, we want to bring in Intel fab. How do we get an Intel fab in fill in the blank country? We're being aggressively courted by other countries that are very quick and very willing to help make up that cost differential. If the U.S. walks away from that, it's just going to make us less competitive. It's going to make us more dependent on the rest of the world.
Well, as they say, computer chips, potato chips, what's the difference? So we'll just start making potato chips. We'll be the global leader in potato chip production.
Well, and I like your report on that.
Bruce, thank you. We'll come back in the overall conversation, but I want to now bring in Dave Vasco from Rockwell. Dave, thank you for joining us.
Rob, thank you.
Over to you.
Sure. So, we help make potato chips, and the aerodynamics and developing the some of the technology is pretty amazing too, but not as much as some. I want to thank Senators Young and Schumer for really getting this kicked off, and we are so excited to see these programs going forward and really the funding going forward. Before this, we really have seen a lot of great work happening. You look at Manufacturing USA, you look at MEPs, you look at a lot of the research that's going on, but it's simply not at scale enough for us to be competitive. I participate in standards meetings all across the world, and it's really disappointing that we really aren't helping our industries be competitive. And I'm excited to see where we're getting there. You look at what's happened in the last 2 years, and we've seen gaps and problems we've had in the industries with the resiliency of the supply chain, the cybersecurity problems we've had, the lack of flexibility where some manufacturers are able to produce and and just working 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, and some that are shutting down the plants because they can't pivot. So these technologies are becoming much more important in the future for the U.S. to be competitive. As we're looking in the future, looking at 4.0 technologies, Industry 4.0 technologies, smart manufacturing, that's really going to provide differentiation. And we need to make sure everybody can adopt that. Things like artificial intelligence and quantum computing and cybersecurity are going to be more impactful in the future. And we need to make sure that it's not just the large and the trendsetters, but there's so much that can be applied by the small, medium manufacturers, all the manufacturers throughout, to really ensure that we have the technology we need, that we have the people that can do this. And that's really going to be the challenges, taking those best practices and helping those manufacturers, the smaller manufacturers, medium manufacturers, really adopt those things so they're able to really scale up their industry, be competitive. More and more, having those small, medium manufacturers integrated in with the large manufacturers is important for the supply chain. We've seen where security problems can occur in these smaller manufacturers, and those can then roll into the large manufacturers. So actually having those tied together and being able to work better together, as this really does, helps us a lot. And really, the key of why we should do these programs is really delivering this technology at scale, being able to ensure that it's just not a fraction of the industry that's able to apply these best practices, that everybody within the manufacturing ecosystem is able to apply these best practices and be competitive for the future.
So, Dave, yeah, it's interesting. The National Science Foundation just came out with a new report, their annual R&D and innovation survey. It's a really great survey now, much better than it was 5 years ago. They ask now very detailed questions about how much are you adopting robotics and automation, AI, cloud computing, et cetera. And the numbers are quite striking, because what you find is that large companies are significantly ahead of small companies, and that just fundamentally cannot be sustainable. We need everybody in the ecosystem, as you point out. One of the key agencies in the federal government, in fact, it was my first job, was at NIST. So I love NIST, but you've been really involved in NIST, partly because of the VCAT and other areas. Why are the bills, both the House and the Senate bill, what do they do for NIST? Why is that important?
Yeah, I think they provide additional support for NIST. I mean, the two elements there are obviously the MEPs and being able to expand that network and hit some of the key challenges, like cybersecurity. That's a big one. It's difficult for smaller businesses to really be able to understand how to apply cybersecurity properly. They may not have the resources to have dedicated people, and having best practice, being able to share that, being able to help those businesses along is critical. And both the bills really provide funding around expanding the support of the manufacturing extension partnership, making sure that more of those businesses can adopt the technologies. Robotics is a good example. It's difficult for a small manufacturer to do the research, to figure out how to apply, where it provides value. But if they're given a hand, given the information, they can then apply those things quite readily and really scale up a business and really expand the business, where they're pulling more and more of the work into their shops. They're utilizing their environments much more than they have in the past, and they're much more efficient.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we tend to ignore in Washington, besides manufacturing overall, because Washington has no manufacturing. I mean, maybe there's a printing plant somewhere here, but Milwaukee has manufacturing, LA has manufacturing, Dallas, New York, but we tend to ignore it. But one of the things we especially ignore are smaller companies. And one of the things that's interesting happening now with the with the resupply or the supply of the Ukrainians with some of our most advanced missiles. We're drawing down that we don't have unlimited missiles sitting in the warehouse, and we're drawing them down. And I was talking to somebody recently who's involved in the defense world, and they said it's not clear how strong our third and fourth tier suppliers are in that world. Obviously, the big companies, the Raytheons, the Lockheeds are strong, but we need to be sure that those third and fourth tier companies have the capabilities, both technologically as well as through scaling. And that's, to me, one of the things that this bill does.
Yeah, Rob, I think it's an important point, and we saw that with some of the supply chain problems, that a lot of the third and fourth tier suppliers were really taxed by a lot of the demands and be able to react. So being able to strengthen them and really have a good idea of what's actually out there, what the real resiliency, what the extra capacity is, that's critical, and this bill really does address it.
So one of the things that I don't want to make it sound like I don't like anything in the House bill, because I do, but one of the things I especially like in the House bill is I believe it's a $46 billion program. The House bill establishes an Office of Manufacturing Security and Resilience with $46 billion to map and monitor supply chains, provide financial assistance to strengthen supply chains, and equip the private sector with tools and best practices to deal with weaknesses. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, I agree. It's vitally important. When our supply chains are working, it's difficult to tell where they're going to break. But understanding the resiliency and really doing the test, make sure we understand how much capacity there is, how much flexibility there is within the supply chain, it's critical. And I think that really the House bill really does have the opportunity to really address that.
That's great. One last question, Dave. ITIF was pretty intimately and critically involved, particularly Stephen Ezell, on helping the Obama administration launch what ended up becoming Manufacturing USA. At the time, it was the National Institutes of Manufacturing Innovation. This is something that we've done. It's now there's a law in Congress, but one of the things that these bills do is it expands Manufacturing USA. Thoughts on that? Why is that important? How does the program work?
Yeah, we are really strong supporters of Manufacturing USA. So we've been involved in 5 of the institutes. I'll give you one example. So we're involved in Army BioFab USA, and they are doing regenerative medicine. Basically, they're developing tissue, human tissue, and eventually organs, and that'll just eventually eliminate donors altogether. So somebody be able to grow their own skin or whatever, their own bone, macular cells, whatever they need from their own body, and it won't be rejected. The state of the art before that happened was really in labs. You had all these incredibly brilliant professors doing great work, but when you tried to scale it, it just didn't scale. You had the same thing you do in a lab with a petri dish and a bunch of PhDs running these manufacturing lines. It didn't scale. So Manufacturing USA really allowed us to take that very artisan process and create a modular, closed loop, scalable production line where there was no involvement with humans. You just put the cells in, and to 45 days out, you get a final tissue sample. And that's something you can scale. And it has to be scalable to really provide those tissues and those organs at the right cost levels. Right now, we had 1 pilot. Right now, they have 8 pilot lines that are going, trying different tissues, different types of organs, and that's gonna expand. And they're going from just doing that basic process now to adding extra layers of sensors to make sure we could have higher yields and have higher quality and get things right the first time going through. So such incredible growth there, taking it from something that was handmade to something that's really turning into full production. And it's really just largely putting the right people together with common direction. So we really love those programs and the innovation they've been able to deliver.
Yeah, and for folks who don't know about that program, there's, I believe, 15 centers now. They're located all throughout the country. To have a center, you have to have actually money from industry. This is not just government. Industry has to have buy-in. You know, one thing that's interesting, I was talking to some folks who had visited China around what they're doing, and they've copied our program. I believe they're going to 45 centers instead of 15, and most of their centers are order of magnitude larger than ours in terms of funding. So they're going great guns at that because they see advanced manufacturing as the core to their future success. So I'm glad that the House and Senate bills both do this.
Yeah, and you're right. The Chinese really did copy a lot of the same programs and the structure of it, and it is a good program. So we need to continue to build upon it and expand it.
Great. Well, Dave, thank you so much. We're going to turn over now to David Hart, and we'll bring Dave Vasco back in. So, David, over to you.
Thanks, Rob, for the invitation to share some thoughts today on this very important legislation. As you mentioned, I'm the director of our clean energy program, so I'm going to comment on those aspects of these bills. I'm going to go big picture first, but I'm going to close by mentioning some smaller provisions that I hope to see included in the final package. Let me begin by laying out a premise. Clean energy innovation, including innovation for clean manufacturing, is essential to U.S. competitiveness. The world needs to go through a transition to reduce and then eliminate greenhouse gas emissions, and that's going to have a transformative impact on numerous economic sectors. The transition has already begun in electric power, and it's rapidly gaining momentum in autos and transportation. And soon it's going to pick up steam in heavy industry like metals and chemicals. So this transition has the potential to upend the global division of labor in these sectors, many of which are very large. That means the U.S. needs an integrated climate, clean energy, and manufacturing strategy. And we've begun to lay the premises of that out in our reports, including one that we issued last June called Clean Competitiveness. And I would say the two bills that we're discussing today are kind of uneven in their recognition of this imperative. On the Senate side, the USICA bill includes advanced energy and industrial efficiency technologies among the 10 focus areas, which you mentioned, Rob. And there's no doubt that AI, quantum robotics, materials, and others of these 10 focus areas will also make substantial contributions to addressing the climate challenge. Similarly, I'm sure that some of the new regional technology hubs that would focus on energy and climate-related opportunities. But overall, I wouldn't say that the climate challenge is front and center in the bill. There is a $17 billion set aside for the Department of Energy, which was a relatively late addition to the package. That could fund R&D within the 10 focus areas, and it could change the picture. But that's largely a placeholder that leaves a lot of room for interpretation. So it might take some determined implementation to realize the potential in the bill to support U.S. competitiveness in emerging clean energy and climate tech. And that differentiates it, obviously, from chips and some of the other clearly identified areas of emphasis. The House bill, for its part, provides a long overdue reauthorization of the DOE's Office of Science. That's the basic research part of the DOE. But it doesn't do much for DOE's applied energy offices, which are really more relevant to U.S. competitiveness. There is one exception in the House bill, which is a $600 million a year program to fund solar power manufacturing and its supply chain. But in the scheme of things, that's not a very big number. On the other hand, in contrast to the Senate, the House bill's Regional Hubs program calls out clean energy as a potential focus area. And then going a little smaller, the House bill includes a number of focus provisions that would authorize and expand policies and programs that would support U.S. competitiveness. Most of these have previously been piloted by the DOE, and these include vouchers for small businesses to work with national labs, which our colleague Stephen Ezell has helped lead on, support for lab-embedded entrepreneurs, and for clean energy incubators, among other things. The House bill would also establish a private foundation to work with the DOE. This is an idea that ITIF has championed and originated, and it's also in the Senate bill, so we really hope to see this in the final package. What would the best of both bills for clean energy innovation look like? It's certainly worthwhile to authorize DOE's Office of Science and to modernize DOE's tech transfer and commercialization infrastructure, including setting up a DOE foundation. But the bigger payoff would be to target climate, clean energy, and clean manufacturing more directly within the investment portfolio, that is the big dollars. And Senators Lujan and Blackburn have recently suggested this in a letter. So as the bill moves to conference, I hope to see those energy provisions worked out in more detail and focused on the climate challenge. Thanks, Rob, and I appreciate the chance to speak to this issue.
Great. Thank you, David. I guess I just have one question, which is, how much opportunity is there for dual useness here? Dual use historically meant, defense versus commercial, but here I'm using the term dual use, meaning we can address overall U.S. competitiveness and supply chain resiliency, but at the same time, we can make progress on climate goals.
Yeah, I think there are really some important opportunities. And of course, it does depend on the rest of the world. This is a global challenge, and not everybody is moving at the same speed. But I would certainly emphasize, technologies like electric vehicles, like some aspects of clean manufacturing, where there are opportunities to accelerate competitiveness while also meeting the climate challenge. And we're at work on this in a couple of sectors, notably chemicals.
Yeah, you mentioned vehicles. I think that electric vehicles challenge from China could be the black swan. They're doing very, very well. I was reading something, I think it was by Willie Shih at Harvard Business School, talking about just how good Chinese electric vehicles are now. They're not like, you and I are both old enough to remember the Yugo, the Yugoslavian car that was they tried to export to the U.S. and I think it lasted 2 years because it was not very good. That's not where China is, and so it's possible that could be a serious competitive challenge to us.
Yeah, I do think the Chinese program was actually aimed primarily at disrupting the industrial order first, unless climate was a secondary consideration. That said, we're very early in the transition. While China has a head start, there's a long ways to go. Europe has gotten pretty organized on supply chain for EVs, and there's no reason why the U.S. can't also do that. And some of the legislation that's pending, not just USICA, but other bills, would advance that objective.
That's great. David, thank you. We'll come back in the general discussion. I want to bring in my colleague, Stephen Ezell now.
Rob, thank you for the invitation to participate. By the way, just on the previous point, in the year 2008, China had about a 2% share of the global solar panel market. By 2016, it was over 60%. So it's just one example of how China can wrest leadership in advanced technology industries with all of the above type of strategies they use. But today, I want to address an issue related to the legislation as the Senate's USICA and the House's Compete goes to conference. One issue the conferees are going to have to iron out is the structure, mission, and funding of a new unit within the National Science Foundation that would focus on technology and innovation, because the aspects of the two pieces of legislation differ quite significantly. ITIF believes it's important that this unit have a laser-like focus on ensuring future U.S. technology leadership, especially over China, and that the Senate's version of this is far superior to the House's for a number of reasons. First, the Senate bill establishes a directorate for technology and innovation that will be charged specifically with strengthening U.S. leadership in critical technologies, mitigating U.S. technology challenges in the geostrategic arena, and it connects this specifically with $29 billion to be invested in those 10 critical technologies that David mentioned over the next 4 years. In contrast, the House version would create a directorate for science and engineering solutions. It would have a mission to advance R&D solutions to address societal and national challenges for the benefit of all Americans. Now, certainly that's good, and certainly the House legislation does mention competitiveness, but the mission of the directorate in the House bill would be far broader and far more diffuse, including with a mission of addressing other issues such as social and economic inequality challenges. Now, certainly those are laudable goals, and technology and innovation policy can and does play an important role in addressing them. But ITIF believes that the foremost goal of this directorate must be promoting the research, development, and commercialization of technologies like electric batteries, biotechnology, quantum computers that can be game changers for U.S. economic and national security for decades into the future. To that end, perhaps most importantly, in the Senate bill, the criteria for making awards for research grants includes, quote, the consideration by the applicant of future commercial applications of the project, including the feasibility of partnering with one or more commercial entities. In fact, it even states that the directorate, whose leaders should have some experience in the industry, in industry, incidentally, when it awards funds, it must give preference to the amount of funds from industry organizations. Now, that's important because it ensures that research conducted is relevant to U.S. industry and it creates pathways for industrial commercialization and deployment of those technologies inside the United States. And the House bill makes no such requirement. The Senate bill also includes real metrics related to commercialization for an award under this section. There's more kind of accountability for real commercialization. But perhaps the most significant difference is the amount of funding that the pieces of legislation put to this unit. The House bill by FY26 would afford $3.5 billion to it, 19% of the NSF budget. In contrast, the Senate legislation would authorize $9.3 billion for the directorate, which would account for 43% of the NSF's budget. In other words, almost half of NSF would now be focused on this core competitive mission. And there should be no doubt that the differences in these two proposals are not simply technical. They reflect longstanding and deeply underlying views about the optimal structure of U.S. science policy, with one vision wanting to align science policy with the goals of technological innovation and competitiveness, and the other hewing to the traditional view, that the science community should have larger control over what it wants to study with federal funding and be more PI driven. That approach might have worked when the US clearly led the world technologically, and few nations or foreign firms had the technical capability to capitalize on US basic scientific research, which really does represent a global public good. But today, science spills over internationally much more than the applied research and technology development do. And one of the biggest beneficiaries is China. Leadership in the future is going to go to those countries who are able to extract practical value out of science and engineering for technologies. And that's why this issue is important. And that's why, in our view, the directorate needs to have the remit, funding, and structure to really have a single-minded focus on US technology leadership in the future. And as Congress goes to conference, they should really align with the Senate's approach. One final point here, Rob. You and David talked about the importance of the manufacturing extension partnership, vitally critical to helping our small manufacturers compete. Here again, the Senate version of the legislation would have $2.4 billion, whereas the House has $1.4 billion. Let's go for the higher number.
Great. Thank you, Stephen. One of the points that some of the pure science advocates make is that somehow trying to focus on commercialization, or even thinking about commercialization or spin-offs to new startups or working with industry, somehow corrupts the core mission of basic science. And what's really interesting is that it just fundamentally false. The person who's done the most work in this area is a professor at North Carolina State University, Dennis Gray. And Dennis has evaluated for years. I mentioned earlier with Senator Young, when President Reagan was confronting this challenge, he charged Eric Bloch, the NSF director, to move NSF in this direction. And one of the programs that they created was the Industry University Cooperative Research Center program. And this, as the name describes, it's universities, industries working together. And Dennis has evaluated that program, and he found actually that there is no reduction of the integrity of science. There's no reduction in terms of writing and getting published core peer-reviewed scholarly journal articles. There's actually more engagement, by the way, in terms of getting women, female scientists, because some of it's a little bit more cross-disciplinary. And then when we look at places like MIT or Caltech or Stanford or University of Utah, who just nobody can say that those are not top-ranked, top-notch science places, but they're also fantastic at working with industry and commercializing. There's a famous MIT study that I think that if you take all of the companies that spun out of MIT, like larger than the GDP of a lot of countries. So I don't know if you want to add anything to that, sort of why this isn't some kind of really fundamentally radical direction for NSF. This is building upon what a lot of leading universities do, and frankly, what some NSF programs already do.
I think I would just add that, internationally, one of the real distinctive strengths of the U.S. innovation system has been that over the past several decades, we've been able to turn our universities into engines of innovation. The Bayh-Dole Act, which allowed for the universities and faculty to, be able to control intellectual property derived from federal R&D funding, was catalytic in that endeavor. And another point there is when universities today try to compete for the best faculty and the best students one of the selling points is the quality of the incubators and accelerators they have on campus to support innovation activities. And so, fundamentally, the strength of America's innovation system is public, private, and academic partnership. And, to your point about Dennis Gray's research, I don't believe that this, more focus on research and commercialization would corrupt that endeavor.
Okay, thank you, Stephen. All right, so if we could bring everybody back into the discussion. Great. So we're going to have some questions from the audience here, and we'll turn to those in just a few minutes. If you have questions, feel free to put them into the chat through Slido or StreamYard. But before we do that, I just want to ask, first of all, any responses to anything anybody has said that you would like to add now?
Sure, Rob, I'd like to jump in just what you and Steve have been talking about as far as really having the applied research along with the fundamental research. Biomanufacturing is a perfect example. Until we were able to create closed system control systems, there was no need for doing a lot of the sensor technology. I mean, things we're doing now are non-destructive, continuous sensors of these process. That need wasn't even there. And now that is the major bottleneck, huge amounts of research there. So by doing the applied work and presenting those problems, defining what the problems are, that really drives a lot of the fundamental and foundational research. So I think there really is a nice match between those two.
Great, thank you. Stephen.
So the point was raised earlier about whether this competitiveness legislation is copying China. Not at all. Let me give you an example. Here's what China does. Let's take semiconductors. So China decided it wanted to be competitive in the memory space of the semiconductor market. So the government, through the $170 billion National Integrated Circuit Fund and the province of Hubei, went out and stood up with a $24 billion investment from scratch a new company called Yangtze Memory Technologies to compete against Micron and Samsung, et cetera. That is the government going in and from the ground up creating a new company. It's as if America said, we're going to create a national quantum computing company. Another example is that 40% of SMIC's revenues are direct government handouts of equity to sustain the firm. Now that gives these firms the ability to compete on a non-market basis in the global economy. And that's especially damaging because these firms can subsist and compete without having to earn market-based rates of return like Intel does. And that's why it's so disruptive to the global semiconductor innovation system.
Great. So I want to jump right into the questions we have here. So there's a question here for Stephen. It says, in addition to MEP, it'd be great to hear your thoughts on the differences between manufacturing USA authorization between the two bills. And Dave, feel free to either I think maybe Dave or Stephen jump into that one. Which one, how they differ and which is better?
Yeah, well, here again, I think the Senate's version is better. My understanding is the Senate legislation calls for $1.2 billion for manufacturing USA, whereas the House version of the legislation calls for $0.283 billion, $203 million. Again, order of difference in magnitude. And this is a vitally important program, as y'all talked about. Again, let's go with a higher number.
Stephen, I entirely agree. And really, there's a huge amount of really impactful work being done. We need to leverage that, and we need to expand on it more.
Great. So another question is, considering the broad focus of repositioning the global fab footprint, to what extent are specialized skills and training also needed there and government support for that? Maybe over to you, Bruce. It's one thing to have capital, but if we don't have the investment in fabs, but if we don't have the workers, it's all for naught.
Yeah, no, look, you have hit what is a remarkably important question. One of our biggest challenges, our fabs employ, for example, in Ohio, we're going to be creating about 7,000 construction jobs in building it. And then we're also going to have about 3,000 workers in those fabs. And the challenge is those aren't workers who exist today. And so as a company, Intel, we actually very actively partner with community colleges, with other educational institutions, but that's not enough. It's got to be a public-private partnerships. Companies can do part of it, because frankly, we have to create the workforce of the future for ourselves. But there's a critical role that the U.S. government plays and state governments play in helping us to do that. So, having that workforce to be able to do, a fab is a great example. These are very technical jobs. The good news is we're very successful at hiring veterans and community college students and people who with the appropriate training can do it, and they pay really, really well. They're great jobs. But having that workforce, without that workforce, that's one of our biggest challenges. And we see that all the time. And unfortunately, the good news is when we build one of our fabs, it also results in a lot of our suppliers moving nearby as well. So we end up in a situation that the job multiplier is anywhere between 7 and 10 jobs created, by our investment. The challenge is then finding workers for that as well. And so, just as an example, we have these great partnerships in Arizona with the community colleges and so forth. But we actually just announced a $150 million program total we're doing with the National Science Foundation, rooted in Ohio, but also is going to have a national component to help build that workforce for the future for us, because it's just so critically important.
If I could just briefly add on to that point, today, 81% of electrical engineering and 79% of computer science students pursuing master's or PhD work in U.S. universities are foreign born. Now, it's wonderful that we're attracting that talent, but it does indicate that we really have to work hard to develop our own domestic STEM talent pipeline. It's time for like a National Innovation Education Act on the order of the National Defense Education Act of the 50s to ensure that we're developing our domestic workforce to produce these technologies in the future.
It relates, that's a good segue into the next question, which is that COMPETES includes an entrepreneur, the House bill includes an entrepreneur visa and a green card for PhD STEM graduates, but USICA doesn't. Any thoughts on whether in conference, whether that might get included, including whether Republicans in the Senate might support some of those provisions?
I can't tell you if it will, but it should, because the reality is we need to be attracting the best and brightest from around the world. One of the things that's always made, I think, America's great strength, and particularly vis-a-vis some of our competitors, is the ability to attract the finest and highest quality foreign talent. It's crazy that we are not doing more that if people want to come live in the United States. Intel is a great example. We have a huge number of our folks, later become citizens or they have green cards, but a good number of people. We recruit and actively recruit the best and the brightest in the United States, but also from around the world. So that would be very helpful. I can't speak to whether it will be in, but I sure hope it will, because it's so important to U.S. competitiveness.
Yeah, we agree, Bruce. One amendment to that is the entrepreneurship visa we like, but what we would like is for the entrepreneurship visa to be more targeted to key industries and traded sectors. There are people who get an entrepreneurship visa to open up a fast food, a donut shop. It's like, what difference does that make? Not to be crass, but where we really benefit from entrepreneurs coming in and creating a business, when somebody creates a small shop, a company making advanced lasers or some kind of drones or whatever. So that would be the one caveat we would make, but totally agree with you.
Yeah, and I was speaking more to immigration more broadly.
Right.
Your point is right. I can't speak to that individual program, but I will say we have to do something about immigration more broadly in this country. We're falling behind because we're not able to attract and retain the best talent.
Yeah, not to go off on a tangent. One of the problems with that debate is it gets conflated with the low skill debate, and the evidence on the high skill part, particularly there's an interesting and important debate about H-1Bs, and I get that. But that, to me, H-1Bs, low skill, it should all be separated. This is not about that. This is about allowing the best and the brightest to come here and have residency and ultimately a path to citizenship. So there's another question which I'll ask, but I don't know that anybody knows the answer. Many organizations, including ITIF, have opposed the inclusion of the Shop Safe bill in the final compromise bill. Any thoughts on where it stands? The Shop Safe bill is actually part of a number of different components in there penalize China or to do these things. It's kind of like, Bruce, that what we talked about earlier with not allowing chips companies to get support if they're in China. I would say I don't know where that stands. Our view is, look, let's keep this bill focused on what it should be and not include a lot of other ancillary things, which would just lead to more potential conflict. And let's focus on what it should be, which is about competitiveness. Another question here is, should these bills pass, what are the chances there would be funding for non-chips provisions in the future? And I take that to mean that there are important industries. I know, Bruce, it's hard for you to hear this, okay? There are important industries besides the semiconductor industry. One that I would put down there would be batteries. You can look at this one either way. This is an opening for strategic investment to ensure key industries, or this is we've done it once and we can't do it again. David, you want to maybe take a shot at that?
Yeah, I really think it's important for us to sustain the investment. The infrastructure bill contained a number of important investments in clean energy, but we're still just beginning the pathway to that, and we haven't covered all the different sectors that need to be dealt with. So we, of course, always have hard fiscal choices to make. They're made harder by the geopolitical and economic situation, but this is an imperative. We've got to invest in our national future, and as you've often talked about, Rob, the trade-off between investment and redistribution is crucial. So I would like to see that investment. What the prospects are, I can't say for sure. As they say, prediction is hard, especially about the future. But I would just echo what others have said. This is an important need, and I would like to see it happen. Whether it really will or not, I don't know.
Great. Somebody did mention in the chat as we were discussing that the FY22 omnibus does direct OSTP to create a STEM education and workforce pipeline strategy, which is useful. So interesting question. How much and how long, and more importantly, why should public money be spent on certain R&D areas, and why can't industry solve this themselves? So this is a perennial question. Like, should the government do more? Does it crowd out industry? Does it crowd in? Why doesn't industry do this on their own? And I'm not talking about the incentives part, which we, I think, pretty clearly handled, but more the R&D part. So thoughts on that? Go back to you again, David. I know you've written on that, but anybody really?
Yeah, there are certainly things that industry can do and should do, but the public investment is complementary. So I think many people get confused with the idea that public money somehow crowds out private money. Generally, the research has shown that's not the case. And certainly in energy, there's a lot of complementarity where there's a big incumbent investment in the current trajectory, and we need to change the trajectory. But I think that's true in a lot of other areas as well. So there's a real complementarity. The more public investment that is made, up to some threshold, obviously, the more private sector investment follows.
And a great example of that is in the life sciences space. Chatterjee and Rohrbach had a paper where they estimated that on average, about $100 of development in the clinical trials and testing and drug development went in for about every dollar of government NIH support for basic scientific research funding. So this is one example of an industry where there is really effective complementarity between the public investment in basic scientific research and then the private sector's role in development and application.
Yeah, and we've seen that within Manufacturing USA, the pilot projects there, just that initial funding to get things started, to make that connection, really just moves a lot of companies along. It brings in a lot of industry funding, but that's really the difference between a lot of these projects getting done or not ever getting started.
Yeah, and also, not to bring up too much of a controversial issue, it's harder for companies to justify that. If you're in the engineering department, it's harder to justify that. According to the Business Roundtable, the surveyed 100 top members, 80% of their chief financial officers said they would cut R&D this quarter to meet earnings targets. Now we can say, geez, those companies are stupid, or these companies shouldn't do it. Reality is that's oftentimes difficult for companies to make those kinds of investments. And so, Dave, to your point, a little bit of seed money, a little bit of priming the pump, then get things going.
And if you look at how countries like Germany do it with their Fraunhofer institutes, that's a structure in which industry gets together with universities. And industry says, here's where we see the product roadmap for electric vehicles or autonomous driving systems going over the next decade. Here's what we don't know how to do. Here's where we need PhD researchers at German universities solving these problems and then socializing that knowledge back into the entire industrial ecosystem. So it's a collaboration to identify where the technologies are evolving in the future and how academic research can help solve those things and then feed back the knowledge to support industrial competitiveness.
So another question is interesting one. How will we support very small companies with innovation? The worry of this person is that maybe mature companies or larger companies get the lion's share of support. Thoughts on how both the bills address that, and do they do enough to ensure sort of the garage startup that's going to be critical in 5-10 years?
I'll make a contribution at that, and maybe then you, David. A recent study by McKinsey found that fully 25% of U.S. small manufacturers can barely meet their working capital cost, right? So they can barely cover payroll. So how are they going to be able to invest in these more efficient Industry 4.0 technologies? So there's a movement afoot on the Hill. I understand more legislation will be coming to provide a much larger package of grants specifically targeted for small manufacturers so they could invest in these technologies and be able to start to see their return much more quickly.
Dave, one of the things also, because I think people have a view that the Manufacturing USA programs are only for bigger companies like Rockwell, but that's not been my experience when I visited them. But why don't you say more if that's true or not?
Yeah, so I mean, definitely that technology, those innovations gets pushed out, and we're trying to really strengthen that so that serves as a feeder for the MEP programs to actually push out those best practices to the smaller companies. And one of the other things I guess I'd like to talk about too is that there's a geographic nature, and these bills really are looking at a geographic distribution, not just bi-coastal, but throughout the country. And a lot of the smaller manufacturers are in the Midwest or other parts of the country, and having that support for those centers in those areas is crucial to making that happen.
Yeah.
Hey, can I add one thing, Rob, real quick?
Yeah,
Which is
please.
the Commerce Department and working on creating the manufacturing institutes. That was part of the idea, though, is it was supposed to be a broad consortium, but involving smaller companies was always part of the strategy. We recognize, obviously, there are some big players in an industry, but part of the strength of it and the model was intended to be very broadly inclusive, so that we could actually give smaller companies access to resources they would never have on their own. And so it's a really, really important point.
Yeah, and I would add that the Senate provisions for NSF in USICA are really incredibly valuable to small, innovative startups. Look, Intel, you've got your own R&D lab. Rockwell, you've got your own R&D lab. But if you're a small entrepreneur and you're trying to solve some technical problem or figure something out, your local university can be a critical input to that, where you just don't have those resources. I mean, I look at UC Berkeley, for example, who have one of the university industry partnership programs from NSF focused on MEMS, microelectronic machine systems, I think MEMS stands for. And they've had so many spin-offs and small companies they've worked with where, without that ability to interact with a local university, they just couldn't do it. And so I actually think these NSF provisions in the Senate bill would be really, really important for high growth, innovative, creative startups who are trying to solve a problem.
Yeah, and as I mentioned, in the House side, there are some specific bill provisions related to the national labs that also might help open those up to these kind of high-tech startups, some of which have been piloted, but they haven't rested on a firm legislative footing, and they haven't been funded to the degree they should be.
So we have time for a couple more questions. One is interesting. I don't know that anybody's going to be able to answer that, but thoughts about Netherlands' investment of 10% of federal funding in innovation with the associated framework of industry, government, academia collaboration. So in other words, you have places like the Netherlands and Sweden, Finland, where they're intentionally going towards these partnerships and these collaborations. Certainly other countries are doing it like that.
There's a famous paper by Dan Sarowitz in which he shows the U.S. R&D investment is roughly 10% of its federal budget as the budget goes up and down. So I think it's a question not of how much the U.S. will invest, but how it will invest that share. And it is important, as Stephen said, to shift the balance towards these competitiveness challenges.
Great. Well, as we close, I just want to ask folks last thoughts, other things we haven't mentioned. Maybe Bruce, you want to kick us off? You're on mute, Bruce. Sorry.
I realize that. First of all, thank you for this discussion, because I think this is so important, under discussed. How do we focus on competitiveness? I think the last thing I'd say is, I think what is happening both post-COVID, but also with this whole situation in Ukraine and Eastern Europe, has really led to a fundamental rethink about how we as a country, and particularly our government, approaches these issues. I think there are a lot of people within our government who recognize this stuff was important previously, but I feel like there's a much broader recognition now. We've got to seize this opportunity as a country. We've got to pass the CHIPS Act. We've got to figure out what the follow-ups. I mean, you mentioned investing in the R&D and other technologies. We've got to recognize that, that we're not just, as companies, we're not just competing, but we're competing with countries, whether it's Korea Inc., Taiwan Inc., China Inc., Europe Inc. It's a global competition. And it's not to say it's all about the U.S., because, clearly we just made a big announcement to be investing in Europe, and we're going to partner with a whole bunch of European governments in that process. But if the U.S. sits on the sidelines while the rest of the world moves forward, I would hate in a couple of years for all of us to wake up and realize that we missed a great opportunity and that we're more dependent on the rest of the world, whether that's for semiconductors or for batteries, or you name the innovative and emerging technology. Because I can tell you, I see this every day at Intel. The rest of the world is focused on how they're developing them and how they're the ones who are making them. So we in the United States have to do the same as well.
Bruce, there's that old commercial, we're Avis and we try harder because we're number 2. All those other countries think they're Avis and they think we're Hertz. The problem is maybe we're not Hertz anymore, but maybe we're Avis, but we're certainly going to Avis if we don't work harder.
Can I say one more thing, Rob, which is we've got to recognize this is just the beginning. This is not a one shot, one bill, one point in time, because this has got to have focus. It's got to have continuity. It's got to be a long-term plan, not just a series of one-offs. Because if we do that, it will work, but incrementally, and we'll just find ourselves back with the same challenges.
Great, thank you. Over to Stephen.
I was going to add to that point, Bruce, that this is really a unifying moment, an opportunity for the United States. As you said, Congress will step up and do its job and pass this legislation, but that's only the first inning. Then we turn this over to the administration, the executive branch, and they'll need to move swiftly to start to effectively implement these programs so they can have the impact we're looking for in the decades ahead.
Great, thank you. I'm going to let Dave Vasco have the last word. So, David.
Sure. So,
sorry, Dave, I was going to let you have the last word. Sorry.
Oh, okay, go. Sorry.
David Hart and then Dave Vasco.
Thanks. So as you mentioned, Rob, facts should change minds, and the facts on climate are changing. The impacts are worse than we expected, and it's changing more rapidly. So we need to be thinking now about clean manufacturing over the next 20 or 30 years. And we've got to start preparing those solutions now because they're not ready for deployment yet.
Great. Thank you. Dave, last words.
Thank you, Rob. So we are doing some incredibly innovative work in the U.S., but we are not really applying it uniformly across industries. And that really is a challenge. We saw with the challenge we faced in the last 2 years, just how fragile a lot of our ecosystem is. This bill really these bills really allow us to really take these things to scale and be able to roll those out across industries, across the entire U.S., and are so important. So looking forward to the follow through in this and participating in these programs.
Great, thank you. And I apologize to the folks who submitted significantly more questions than we had time for. Thank you for doing that. Sorry we couldn't get to them. But I want to thank everybody who's joined us, and specifically, especially our 4 speakers here today. So thank you. Hope everybody has a good rest of the day, and we'll keep our fingers crossed that we cross the finish line with this and we get a bill with real money to the president sometime this summer. Thanks, everybody.